This is the Beyond Belief Sobriety Podcast. If you're new to our YouTube channel and our podcast, this is a podcast that explores secular options to recovery from addictions of all kinds. And today we're going to have a topic that we've never covered before on this podcast, and I'm really interested in learning more about it. But it's all about the use of psychedelics in treating addiction, depression, and other mental I guess illnesses or whatever you might want to call it. So anyway, the expert here, or at least a person who is familiar with this topic much more than I am, is Ted Perkins, and he is my guest. Welcome, Ted. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm really happy to be joining your community. Hello, everyone. You're in good hands with Beyond Belief Sobriety.
Well, thanks for being here. So I guess a good way to start, Ted, is why don't you kind of introduce the audience to how you got involved in learning about psychedelics and going down that road as using them for treatment, and what kind of treatment you use. So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, I've used a smart recovery for many years, for like decades, and now I'm a facilitator. So I host meetings, every week, and I have a lovely community of people who have used smart recovery. As you know, smart recovery is a secular, science-based option for people in recovery. It's worked for millions of people, and it's a growing organization. It has, 30 countries are on board. We have thousands of meetings. We transitioned, thousands of meetings from face-to-face to online during COVID, and now many of those are going back. And in my own experience, I was one of those typical people who was surrounded by alcohol, most of their life. And, when I was growing up, my father and mother were in the diplomatic corps. So it was my father's and my mother's job to basically give cocktail parties and talk to foreign dignitaries. And
I grew up like that.
Wine and dine people, because that's part of diplomacy is cocktail parties.
Yep.
So I remember my mother, taking me and my sister in a shopping cart to the local embassy BX, which is like the 7-Eleven of each embassy. And they didn't have any food. They just had bottles and bottles and bottles of liquor, every kind of liquor that you could get, and every type of cigarette that you could buy. So it was sort of like an ABC store, alcohol beverage control type of store,
right.
Everywhere we went. And as I grew older, drinking was obviously, when I was a child, drinking never an issue. But as I got into adulthood and got into these kinds of jobs, I worked for 2 U.S. film studios, and part of my job was a lot of socializing, a lot of social drinking, a lot of expense accounts, a lot of taking people to drinks and dinner, expensive wines, a lot of first class travel, sitting in airport lounges with free drinks and etc. And then, as I got older in my career, I realized that, maybe I had too much time and maybe too much money, and I started to see myself like doing more drinking, by myself. And that became a problem. So I did something about it. And now I would like to say that I'm in successful recovery, thanks to smart recovery. It's given me the tools. But I wanted to, I had taken psychedelics when I was younger, when I was in high school, and several times since then. And I thought that the insights that I gained in those experiences were really profound. And so I thought, maybe it's interesting for me to get a fresh perspective on what may have led to my alcohol use disorder, my addiction, if you want to call it that, and get like more of an interesting perspective on it, because psychedelics are dissociative drugs that allow you to sort of step back from your ego, step back from yourself, and view things in a different dimension. I mean, I think a lot of people tend to focus on psychedelics as a way to see dragons floating around, or walls breathing, or those kinds of visual things. I felt that, growing up, I felt that those things were actually a distraction. I was more entranced and more intrigued by the opportunity to really dig deeply into myself and to see myself in different ways and problem solve and reflect on myself and my relationships and how I felt and what my challenges were. And I found that I had some really interesting results with that. I mean, I recently was telling a story about how an LSD trip with my sister actually, repaired a fractured relationship that,
Wow.
we had really been fighting for years and had a horrible relationship. And then just in one evening when we were both on LSD, we sort of had a real conversation for the first time in decades or ever.
Wow.
And it created a relationship which is now like my most important relationship. I tell my sister that I love her every day, and we talk every day. And so I thought it was very interesting to explore these ways of reconnecting, and then evaluating my own sobriety and my own recovery. Not because I was afraid that I was going to relapse or anything. There's always a danger of that, and it's something that anybody in recovery, as you know, is sort of always
Hmm.
attuned to. But I thought it was a very interesting way to sort of see myself in a new way, and maybe help my recovery along the way, sort of like a booster shot, as it were.
Right. Right.
Because smart recovery, has worked and is working for me and will continue to work. So I'm really a big fan of the program. And as you know, I work for Smart Recovery in the
Hmm.
communications department. I do all their videos, etc. So, and then I've been reading recently in the last couple of years, I saw many articles like you probably have run across about how
Hmm.
ketamine has now been, ketamine is a dissociative psychedelic drug. It's been, and also a horse tranquilizer, apparently.
Oh, I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah, I didn't know. But that has been approved for clinical use for people with PTSD and depression and anxiety, things like that, in a very controlled clinical setting, of course,
Right.
not just freewheeling it. I was never interested in buying drugs on the street. I would never do that. And then I'd also reading a lot that how psilocybin mushrooms were
Hmm.
being used in palliative care, and giving mushrooms to people who had terminal diseases, who knew that they were going to die, were experiencing a great deal of anxiety, and were able to take psychedelic mushrooms and become at peace with the
Hmm.
process and relieve that anxiety. And I thought, and then they were also, in Oregon, psilocybin mushrooms have been psilocybin has been declassified as a harmful drug, and now has been approved for general use by clinicians with prescriptions in controlled settings for people to use in a clinical setting to treat anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders and alcohol use disorders and
Right.
other things. And so we're sort of like at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what these drugs' potentials could be. And I'm
Hmm.
very enthusiastic about the future, what the future holds. And I'm hoping that people can sort of move beyond the stigma that many of these drugs have. I mean, back in the 70s when I was growing up, if you took acid, you were going to go to the top of the Empire State Building and try to
Right.
fly,
Right.
or
Right.
you're going to have a bad trip and you're going to shoot yourself or kill or do a
Exactly.
mass shooting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when you take these psychedelic drugs, the last thing you want to do is hurt anybody. You're
Yeah.
surrounded by love, peace, and general reconnection with the universe. So, given all that, and then I also heard about a drug called ayahuasca, which was sort of very intriguing as well. And I'd grown up in a lot of these different countries in Latin America, and I'm a student of religion and religious traditions, and I thought that the intersection between uh, ayahuasca, which is a psychedelic drug, and
Hmm.
shamanism and religiosity and syncretism, etc., was fascinating to me. So I decided that one of my as part of my fascination with these issues, I thought, well, let's try a couple, see what the experiences are like, and I'm happy to share some of those experiences with you today.
Cool. So the way that these are used to kind of reminds me of hypnosis, and that it's not like a long term use, that you just use it for short term to change your thinking, or to have a new awareness. That the way that they're used. It's not like you're given an antidepressant that you take for years on end on a regular basis, right?
Oh, I doubt whether you'd be able to function uh, in society or even personally if you took the doses
Every
that you're
day.
speaking. But there's a couple different things happening, and this is also a very interesting thing. Is that when you do a psychedelic trip, as it were, if you want to call it a
Hmm.
trip or an experience, um, the experience is transcendent. It's ethereal. It's ephemeral. It's very difficult to describe. It's one of those things where you know what happened, but if you had to write it down on paper or tell somebody, it's really tough. It's ineffable. in a way. It's
Okay.
indescribable. But the experience is important. And so what you take from each experience is something that you then catalog and use, and it becomes a memory. And then you apply that memory of that experience to address other issues. You sometimes you have like extraordinary breakthroughs where you realize, oh my God, I don't want to be a lawyer. I should be a doctor.
Right.
Or
Right.
you know what? I never told my mother that I loved her. I've been so angry at her for something. I'm going to just call her on the phone and clear this up. And then, these amazing breakthroughs can happen. These are just examples of some of the things that happen. Or, somebody with PTSD can take, ecstasy in a clinical setting and a one-time basis, or maybe a couple of
Hmm.
times.
Right.
And in the process of going through that treatment with a psychologist, they reenact or relive what happened. They come to peace with it. They come to terms, and they realize that their guilt about perhaps somebody else's death during a firefight in Iraq has caused them a great deal of anxiety, but they can let that go because what happened happened, and they have the rest of their life to live out. And they become at peace, and they love them, and they're allowed a space to love each other, to love themselves again,
Right.
and move on. And those are one-time experiences or several times experiences.
Right.
Now there's this thing which is called microdosing, which is interesting, where it's become somewhat trendy, where people can take very small quantities of LSD, usually LSD, and they've found that it has applications in the fact that they can still function, do their job, but it
Hmm.
gives them like this little edge, or just this ability to be more empathetic, more open,
Hmm.
and deal with their things and deal with their depression and anxiety. And there's a book about this. It's called A Good Day, or I'm Having a Good Day, or I'll look it up for you. But it's about a lady who suffered from really, really horrible depression, and it was affecting her ability to even work. And she decided to do an experiment where she microdosed every day for a month, or maybe she's still doing it.
Hmm.
And she reveals some of the amazing breakthroughs that she had in her work and her relationships and her ability to function and to overcome her crippling depression in a way that allowed her to live a life. So that is, those are the two things that you can do with these chemicals. I'm sure, at the government level, or at the FDA level, or the, control board level, there is certainly some concern that people will, try to abuse these drugs,
Hmm.
but that's true of any substance. And
Right.
we've seen now at Smart Recovery with the legalization of marijuana, and now people doing concentrated THC and things. We're
Mhm.
finding a lot of people coming into the recovery space where they, started with THC to relieve some either imagined or real physical malady or depression or
Mhm.
what have you, aches and pains, whatever the justification is for getting the card that allows you to buy cannabis, or THC, and now realizing that they've become really dependent on
Right.
that drug, and it's having adverse consequences, like any other substance or behavior
Sure.
that comes along. So
Sure.
so there is the fear that that might be a factor, but I think that the protocols thus far, in terms of, like, the this Controlled Substances Act, and the gradual approach to legalizing psilocybin and mushrooms, and eventually perhaps clinical use of LSD, which is now happening as
Mhm.
well. All of this are in clinical trials with peer-reviewed results and large samples, and I even volunteered to be part of a longitudinal study as well.
Oh, interesting. And what's that? What's involved with that? And have you started that yet?
I haven't done it. I worked with a doctor who had me have a session with ketamine, and
Uh-huh.
I told him about my previous uh, experience with psilocybin, and I also told him that I had, like, I described my level of self perception, etc., and
Mhm.
the fact that I would find myself mentally healthy, and not
Mhm.
in a situation where I would call myself depressed or chronic
Right.
anxiety or anything like that, or PTSD. So he said, "Well, look, you seem like you've got your stuff together enough that we would want somebody who is suffering from some, really challenging
Sure.
mental health issues, and to use them as a
Gotcha.
person to do the drug with." So I didn't quite qualify.
Mhm.
I wasn't screwed up
You've
enough, I
already been
guess.
successfully treated. So
Yeah.
what's interesting about this?
I wouldn't want to say screwed up, because that's
No.
disparate to mental
Right.
health. I
Right.
understand mental health challenges just as much as anybody else does. So
Sure.
yeah.
But what could be interesting about this is that it would save years and years of therapy that a person might have to go through, if I'm understanding this right.
Well, that is one of the promises of especially ecstasy therapy in general,
Mhm.
because it doesn't really involve visions. It's more of a I'm sorry, I don't know
It's
why
okay.
this. Let me take my ringer off. It doesn't involve hallucinations generally.
Mhm.
The world becomes a little bit wobbly and a little energetic, but it's generally psychedelic. Ecstasy is used as a way to connect with people deeply, to love people. That's why people go to raves and they dance with one another and they want to make love
Mhm.
to each other. And I've got to tell you right now, one of the great experiences of my life was making love to my girlfriend on ecstasy at that time. And
Mhm.
it's I can totally see why people like that drug. I mean, there's a way to have a sense of deep connection and love with ecstasy, which is again ineffable, very, very, very extreme, and that's why people and it became very popular with young people who were dating, etc. But that is somewhat like a misuse of what ecstasy,
Right.
what the true potential of that is, and which is that, for instance, using ecstasy in couples counseling shows a lot of promise, where
Huh.
a marriage that is now utterly destroyed, the two people, wife and a husband, or a husband and husband, or wife and a wife, can get together with a trained family counselor, take the drug, and have a breakthrough in their marriage that could have taken years or
Huh.
never
So is it
to
is it
realize.
actually being used? Is it legal for therapists to
Yeah,
use this?
absolutely. Yeah, ecstasy therapy for couples, for PTSD, for other sort of even addictions, etc. So there's different applicability. I mean, uh, ecstasy will give you sort of like a very emotional, short-term therapeutic sort
Mhm.
of situation where you're talking to people because you can function and think and talk and relate.
Mhm.
When you're on LSD, it's a much more powerful drug that is much more about your experience and being out in nature or looking at a wall or thinking or closing your eyes or whatever. It's very difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult to relate to other people, so it's less of a social interaction. It's more of an introspective action. And the same thing with ayahuasca. The ceremony that I did in Costa Rica was basically in a very dark room. Nobody was talking. It's a very personal experience. And mushrooms can be like maybe a hybrid of both, where you're talking to somebody after the peak experience of the hallucinations. You might go outside and talk to people. You might even go to the store and look at all the wonderful products that there are on for sale, and go to the meat section and suddenly become horrified by what you've seen and become a vegetarian, or
Right.
you might really, or there's all kinds of things that can happen with these kinds of drugs. And
Yeah.
they're all resoundingly positive to me. I
Yeah.
mean, there was an article recently in the Washington Post that people are sort of putting the brakes because there have been some instances with people with serious mental health issues and psychoses and things like that were not adequately tested or screened before they went on one of these psychedelic experiences, and then had like a bad trip. and
Right.
and one person out of like millions of people, but one person committed suicide afterwards. And of course people tend to look at that outlier as, oh my god, we got to put the
Right.
brakes on all this stuff. And that's part of the frustration of the people in the movement, is that one bad apple is sort of seen as ruining the whole lot. When you compare the possibility, the risk of somebody having a bad trip, which is very minor if everything is
Mhm.
done correctly,
And if it
to the
happens, couldn't you be talked down from that? Isn't there a way that a good therapist could help somebody unwind that bad experience and
yes,
um,
but
resolve it?
after you've had a, let's say, an LSD trip, for instance, and you come to and you have like a mental health issue that's where you're manic depressive or borderline personality disorder, or I don't know what other
Mhm.
mental factors might go into that. But after the LSD experience, some people, because of their mental illness, might decide that the best recourse is to do something careless,
I
or
see.
contemplate suicide on a different, more intellectual level, as opposed to what they may have been feeling before. And so that is always a possibility. But people who commit suicide, as you know, they're premeditating their suicide.
Right.
That's part of the thing that needs to be treated. LSD does not hasten those suicidal
Sure.
ideations that they know. But
Sure.
that's something that really has to be looked at and taken into account.
I was wondering if using this for addiction, is it working because it's treating the underlying issues around addiction? For example, a lot of people who become addicted to substances or behaviors also have an underlying depression or other problem. Is that why this works for addiction?
I do believe that, but that's my personal opinion. I think, the clinicians and the researchers and everybody are doing tremendous amount of work, and that's why, opening up and liberalizing the use and the prescription and the controlled
Hmm.
use of these substances is important now, because it opens up a space for professionals to really evaluate these drugs in a new way, which allows them to answer the questions that you just posed. So,
Hmm.
you know, um, how does the use of ketamine, for instance, help somebody deal with their alcohol use disorder? Does it give them a sudden flash of insight that says, oh my gosh, that's why I've been drinking all this time. Now I know how to fix that. Or is it something that allows them to deal with, a mental anguish from some traumatic event in childhood that was
Hmm.
causing them guilt or shame? And that they realize that that is the cause of their addiction. And that now by dealing with that, or making a phone call to somebody, or reconciling with somebody who hurt them, or whatever, or forgiving somebody that may have hurt them, a parent or somebody.
Sure.
By going through that process, then the addiction has the possibility of going away by itself, because it was essentially one of the factors in it was this unresolved conflict, problem, guilt, shame, or abuse. So, everybody's different, every situation's different, and that's why I think the clinicians are trying to use their best judgment from a clinical, professional perspective to
Sure.
figure out, what are the best uses to treat addiction. There is one drug which is used in these treatment facilities in South America and Mexico. There's a lot of these in
Oh.
Mexico, and it's for people who have hardcore heroin addictions.
Oh.
And many see this as like sort of like the drug of last resort for them. And
Okay.
you get out to Mexico, and it's a one night experience where they're given a drug, and for the life of me, I can't remember what it is, but it's a psychedelic drug, and it's outlawed here in the States. But I guess you can get it at a pharmacy down in Mexico. I'm not really
Hmm.
sure, or it's approved for clinical use down there. And you take the drug, and you have a one night experience, and people have come back, you know, completely free of their addiction. They go through their withdrawals in a totally different way, and for all intents and purposes, it for a large majority of people, it seems to do the trick, and that's really amazing. I mean, because when it comes to addiction, everybody's looking for the magic pill.
Right.
They're looking for the easy answer, and a lot of people don't realize how much actual work goes into it. We're a society
Yeah.
that's based on, ooh, take a booster shot, or take a pill, or do this 3 times a week, and you'll be fine. Well,
Right, and we think that there's just one route for everyone to take too. We think that
yeah,
there's gotta just be one way of doing it, and there's also a certain amount of resistance in the public at large, and maybe even in the recovery community of medically assisted treatment, which I really don't understand. It's like there's some sort of presumption that because I had a problem with a drug, all drugs are bad and I can't use them to treat my addiction. But we're finding that, medically assisted treatment actually works. And so we have
oh
this
yeah.
resistance to that already. And I imagine there's even more resistance towards the use of psychedelics, or is there?
Well, and I think there's two things, and one of the things I want to touch on is this backlash, not a backlash, but this aversion to medically assisted treatment.
Mhm.
In Smart Recovery, we're all about medically assisted treatment. We are
Mhm.
all about harm reduction. So
Right.
if we're not trying to say that there's a magic bullet, but if there is a drug like Suboxone, or
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
naltrexone,
Naltrexone?
or epinephrine, or anything, or whatever that is, that you can take to alleviate your symptoms, and then gradually through recovery get clean and sober, whatever that looks like, and not hit rock bottom, then
Mhm.
that's a win. Because society, unfortunately, because of the prison industrial complex, and our judicial system is so heavily prejudiced in the form of culpability,
Mhm.
blame, personal responsibility and being chastised and punishment. And
Right.
this, as you know, John, has its roots in the religious Protestant formation of our country, where
Hmm.
everybody's in charge of their own ship. And when they do
Right.
something wrong or against society, they need to be blamed for it. And they need to pay the price to both
Hmm.
society and to God.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, that mentality has then been transferred over to people who with drug addictions, et cetera. And they think that like hitting rock bottom is the only way for them to realize that they have a problem, and
Hmm.
that believe me, these people know that they have a problem. They just don't know where to get help, or
Right.
they're just too addicted to do something about it, or they don't have the resources or the right health insurance or the right support groups. So, hitting rock bottom means that you destroy your family, or you run out of, or you spend all of
Yeah.
your money, or
It
you
shouldn't be
blow through
necessary.
your kids or your kids' college fund, or you get into a drunk driving accident and kill
Hmm.
somebody. If we're leading people down to that rock bottom where we destroy other people along the way, then obviously the rock bottom culpability approach is not working. And then the incarceration is costing the United States billions, if not trillions of dollars a year to keep these people to go through rehab in prison,
Hmm.
which is
Right.
not the ideal situation for people, because they come out of prison, studies have shown they come out of prison more angry and more prone to addiction than ever before, which is why Smart Recovery, I'm very happy to report, has been very influential in getting smart recovery meetings in many, many prisons
Oh, that
here in
is
the
so
United States
good.
and in Canada. We have a program called Inside Out, which has been very successful, where it's been shown that recidivism rates for people who go through our program in the prison system have a much lower chance of relapsing or going back to their ways. They end up becoming successful, prolific, members of society. They go back to society the way that society would have wanted them to go.
Well,
And now
it's
we're
so
seeing,
important too.
of course,
We have
and then,
in where I live, in the state that I live, and I'm probably the state, Missouri, is probably not unusual to other states. There aren't a lot of places that people can go for treatment to at all, and a lot of the ones that we do have are funded by religious organizations, faith-based organizations,
mhm,
and that's fine. But the problem is with that comes a certain ideology and dogma that says that you must not have any sort of medication as you go through your treatment, and that spills over into the greater society. So like there's a law here in Missouri that if you're in jail, the jail cannot deny you your medication for your addiction. But a lot of the
sure,
people, a lot of the sheriffs or whoever that run the jails, they don't know that law exists, and they take these drugs away from people.
yeah,
So to have an organization like SMART that actually goes into those institutions and is science based is
mhm.
incredibly important. And that's not to put down the people who have the faith based option, but it's just so important to value science as far as I'm concerned.
No, exactly. Because and then and since we're beyond belief, we have to get to a point where like we really, you know, which is why your podcast and what you do is very important, because people in recovery who don't see that the 12-step method of like the higher power and the sort of subjugation to a higher power, or the outsourcing of your personal
Right.
responsibility and care to a higher power, is really something that can work for a lot of people, in the sense that like by doing that, you're giving all the responsibility of care over to that higher power, which is why
Hmm.
I don't like you to take medically assisted treatment, because that's in direct conflict with what they're
It
trying to tell
is.
you.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
for instance, then you could make the argument, well, then, you know, God or a deity created these
It's
medications.
just
So
I know,
it's an
I know. It gets kind of crazy.
it's kind of crazy. But let's not forget that the people who started AA were a religious Protestant
Right.
denomination, and it has very clear Christian roots. Nothing against the program. If people use the program and it
Sure.
works for them, wonderful. 12-step is very compatible with Smart Recovery. A lot of people go to both meetings at the same time. I have
Mhm.
nothing bad to say about Smart
No.
Recovery. Been to 12-step meetings, enjoyed them.
Mhm.
Decided
Nice.
that Smart Recovery was a better option for me, since I'm
Mhm.
more self empowerment and science based.
Yep. You know what's interesting? You may already know this, but do you know that the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, actually experimented with LSD as a treatment
Yes,
back in, was it the 60s or maybe even the 50s or before that?
the 40s. Yeah, yeah.
Was it in the
He,
40s?
yeah, no, it's very, that is a true story. And it is true that it's been said, and I don't know how to cite the source, but it's said that Bill's sort of conversion or his moment
Yes, he was
happened
trying to
while on
recreate
LSD.
that. He
Yeah,
was trying
yeah,
to recreate that experience that he had through
hmm,
through psychedelics.
sure,
And this is amazing because this is kind of what we have found is working, right? You're
right,
creating this experience that changes something in your brain and the way that you think that helps
hmm,
you resolve these issues.
yeah,
We're actually finding that that's what's happening.
yeah. Well, these drugs kind of break down. Um, the person is a self, the ego. If you want to use the Freudian way of looking at things,
Mhm.
the ego is, let's say, let's say my drinking, and my ego is built around. I've got justifications for why I drink. I've got business to do. I like the feeling. I'm not a danger to anybody. I'm not a danger to myself. This is fine. I'm young. It's great. I party. I can go out on dates. I'm popular. I'm funny. All these other things, and this becomes a very cleverly erected castle that you put around your ego, which is fragile. And we all know that the ego is very fragile. So we put up these barriers to sort of block ourselves in. And then when somebody pokes at that barrier, we lash out angrily and say, "You're wrong." We make them wrong. We use sort of like, we have cognitive dissonance and all these other biases
Mhm.
that we apply to other people. When you take LSD or these other drugs, those cognitive biases and dissonance just completely evaporates. And so those walls that you've cleverly erected around your ego, they suddenly come crumbling down, and you're left with yourself and a
Yeah.
conversation that you can have yourself. And in my own case, many years ago, I think about 30 years ago or 28 years ago, the first time that I ever had the knowledge that I had an alcohol use disorder was when I
Mhm.
was on LSD, and I was talking to a friend, and I wanted to go
Interesting.
get beer, and he was like, "Why do you want to go get beer?" And I'm like, uh, I don't know. I want to drink a lot of beer. Why do I want to do that? It suddenly dawned on me, like, wow, it was a huge revelation for me, and
Yep.
that was the start of my recovery journey 30 years ago. Was LSD the same way that what happened with Bill?
Yep. And you know who else I believe is finding this helpful is Sam Harris. Have you read much about his experiences and what he's doing?
Absolutely. I've read all of his books. I follow his
Yeah.
blogs. I have
Yeah.
Calm. He's a big hero of mine. I
Yeah.
actually introduced myself to him once and told him he's doing a great job.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting that he's gotten involved in that? And that's been a little bit controversial just in the atheist community, hasn't it? Because he's kind of gone on into sort of a spiritual direction because of that experience.
Well, I think unfortunately, and this is part of the problem of, materialism
Mhm.
and science. It leaves no room for anything else but what is seen and heard and perceived and analyzed and scientifically cataloged. And I'm a materialist. I don't believe in any higher powers or
Mhm.
superstitions or those things. And I look with baffled amazement as people, believe all kinds of crazy things with no
Right.
proof or no science behind it. It almost seems like the belief in belief is more important than actually testing anything anymore, which is sad because the United States and several other countries have gone through many different periods of, like, rationality and science was like really super cool in the 50s, and then suddenly
Right.
around Reagan and everything and the moral majority, it
Right.
started moving in a different direction. And
Mhm.
now, we're in a totally different, bizarre
Mhm.
phase of it. But the main point is that, materialism, the people who want to believe in something more than what is seen and heard, they want to believe in a soul or perhaps an afterlife. They
Right.
want things that are they want to believe in things that are more than just what they can see or hear. Because a lot of people look at the world and they see crap. They see horribleness. They see the world for really what it is. They see the world in the same way that the Buddha, when he was a prince, left the confines of his palace and saw reality and suffering
Mhm.
for the first time. And I think it's a natural human tendency to kind of
Sure.
create magical thinking to deal with those things, and
Mhm.
not face them head on, and sort
Mhm.
of, and so that's a natural impulse. And I don't say anything against that. Um, so, but and of course, when that impulse for self-delusion and magical thinking crosses over into public life, that's a problem.
Right.
Like what's happening in Texas and what happens in our political system, when
Sure.
just believing whatever you want is actually okay as long as you believe
Right.
it. That makes it true.
As long as you don't have
So
everybody else try to believe what you believe. That's the
yeah,
issue that I
um,
have too.
yeah. So to answer more to the point of the question, then but there are other avenues of exploration that have to do with your mind and
Mhm.
meditation and something that's, like I said, ineffable. And when you take an LSD trip, for instance, and you feel at one with the universe, and you close your eyes and you see a black hole, and you see all of creation emerging out of it, you realize that you're part of like a bigger purpose, and you see how quantum physics all relates to reality and the future, and you have like one of these incredible experiences. Like I said, you can't put that down to scientific terms. So when you come out of something like that, if you had that experience, a scientist who's looking at you will say, well, you had a physiological effect in your brain where the lysergic acid dithylamine actually enabled you to generate more input into your synapses, which released a flood of endorphins, which then combined with your dopamine to do this. So they can get a very scientific analysis of what happened to you,
Right.
but that doesn't get to the core of what it meant. And
Right.
so that's what Sam Harris and other people, and what I'm trying to also discuss today, is that the ineffable quality of these experiences is actually the
Interesting.
most valuable. Because if I came out of my ketamine experience with the doctor telling me, well, your dopamine surged and must have been great for you, that that doesn't do anything for me.
No.
But if I say, this experience helped me resolve this issue with my mom, let's say, for instance,
That's what matters.
that has real substance and use and
Right.
utility. And so I
Right.
think that's where Sam and other people are
Okay.
going.
Okay. Well, I find that interesting. So, where could the listeners to this podcast go to learn more about psychedelics as a possible treatment for um, addiction or other mental illnesses?
Well, I think just doing a Google search will
Hmm.
will unearth like a lot of peer-reviewed publications that have come
And
out.
that's what I actually did today. There are actually quite a few
There's
peer
quite a few.
review. Yeah.
But for the general reader who's interested in just figuring out, there's a book by Michael Pollan, the guy who
Hmm.
wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, and
Hmm.
it's called How to Change Your Mind.
Okay.
Michael, if you're listening to this, I'm plugging your book. I'm a big fan. Keep on writing. Don't ever stop. But that is a wonderful view of the history of the psychedelic movement, a look at all of the different traditions that use it, shamans, etc. A look at his personal experience with the drugs and where the drug is going, possibly in the future. So that I think that's a great primer on the whole issue.
I'm gonna get that. This discussion that I've had with you is my first real exploration into this subject. I mean, I've read
Right.
articles. I mean, I read the newspaper and I've read articles here and there about it being used. So I know in the back of my mind that this is going on, that there's research that's happening out there, but I never really have, investigated it any further than those little blurbs that I read in the paper. So it's been
Uh-huh.
interesting to talk to someone who's familiar with this and kind of sparked my interest to learn more about it. So
Hmm.
thank you for that.
Sure, absolutely. And then there's another book which I think is very cool, which is A Really Good Day: How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage,
Ah,
and My Life. So
interesting.
that is another book that people might want to look at. There are other, there's, if you want to go really deep, you could read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. You could read. There's all kinds of books about these experiences. People have written quite a lot, and there's also a Center for Psychedelic Studies, and there's Esalen Institute approach to looking at this kind of stuff. It's all very fertile ground, and a lot of
Hmm.
people talking about it and experimenting with it. And listen, psychedelic substances have been around for thousands of years. They
Sure.
were part of human experience. I mean, 15,000 years ago, some dude, some lady
Sure.
accidentally tried to eat a frog that happened to
Yeah.
have coated with those psychedelic substances, and said, "Wow, we should really like lick more of these frogs." And ayahuasca, there's indications that it was prepared thousands of years ago in these
Hmm.
shamanic traditions by the Mayans or the
Interesting.
Incas. And so, and as we know, alcohol has been around since, since
Hmm.
apes. They learned how to
Hmm.
ferment fruit, rotting fruit.
Hmm.
It's been part of human existence. In fact, I would even say that a lot of the tendencies for prophets, prophecy, and religious sentiments, etc., could have been hastened by alcohol or
Yeah.
other drugs or even psychedelics.
Well,
Don't discount the
they use
possibility.
alcohol in all these religious ceremonies, so
Yeah,
it could very well could be.
alcohol is part of these things. The whirling dervishes, they get
Yeah.
overly oxygenated blood. They have epiphanies, and just
Hmm.
like I had an epiphany. And there are religions, and there's one in Brazil called Daime, where
Uh-huh.
ayahuasca is part of their foundational religious experience and the religious
Right.
ceremony. In the same way that peyote is a sanctioned and legalized way for Native Americans to
Right.
celebrate their shamanic rituals as well here in the United States.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for doing this and educating me and the listeners here to our podcast and the viewers on our YouTube channel. It's been valuable. I'm definitely going to check out the books, and thank you for putting them in the notes here. I'll be sure to include those in the show notes of the podcast when we post that. So again, Ted, so nice of you to come aboard to talk about this. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Happy trails to everybody, or happy
Yeah.
trips.
Okay.